Jo Huxster is an associate professor of environmental studies at Eckerd College, whose research focuses on environmental communication. Jo, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you for having me.
So, to start, could you just tell the audience about your kind of career journey to what led you to doing this work around environmental communication?
Sure. I grew up in the woods in Pennsylvania, and I've always been really interested in, quote unquote, the environment and the natural world around us. And so I always kind of knew I was going to get into some sort of environmentally related field, even from a young age. And I went to college thinking I was going to do something more biological, maybe like marine biology. And I started doing that kind of study and realized that I was more interested in sort of the human environment interactions, and that maybe I wasn't great as a lab technician. I didn't work that well in the lab, and that I was better at interacting with people. And so I started moving more towards policy. I went to graduate school for environmental and marine policy. And then in grad school, I really became focused on climate change and public understanding of climate change and communication around climate change. And so after graduate school, I got my PhD at the University of Delaware, and then I did two postdoctoral programs focused on public opinion on climate change and then on public understanding of science. And I did those at Drexel and then at Bucknell University. And then I got to Eckerd College, which is where I am now. And I study and teach environmental communication, climate change communication, and then public understanding of what we call ideologically entangled sciences. So things that have become linked to politics or linked to ideology that are scientific issues. And so, that's sort of the evolution of my journey to where I am now.
Awesome. Well, I want to kind of start by asking about where we are at in climate change conversations
Mm.
publicly and in policymaking. I'm curious, are climate change conversations shifting from mitigation to adaptation right now?
That's a good question. I think we're talking more about adaptation than we were. And I think that's for good reason. We've already seen a great deal of environmental change. We are already seeing, intense sea level rise, particularly along the east coast of the United States. We're already seeing more intense storms, like here in Florida, where I am. The hurricanes are hitting us hard. And so we're starting to see serious changes in agriculture too, across the United States. So we're starting to have adaptation conversations. They're sort of been forced. I don't see the mitigation conversations going away though. So I don't really see them replacing adaptation, replacing mitigation. I'm seeing it as an additional conversation that's being had. And something that's interesting about adaptation conversations is that they can be had without being focused solely on climate change. People can sort of tiptoe around the subject and still talk about adaptation. We could still talk about how we adapt to storms without saying why they're getting worse. So I think those conversations are happening with a broader audience or with a broader swath of people, the adaptation conversations, because you don't have to necessarily be super accepting of climate change to want to adapt to changes that you're seeing.
Yeah. Well, that leads me to another question about how we make the case to policymakers for climate change to be prioritized over other issues. And maybe I'm curious if part of it is this notion of adaptation, not uh, necessarily tying it directly to climate change, but just the
Mhm.
importance of dealing with the storms, or how do you think about that? How should we try to make the case to policymakers to prioritize climate change over other issues?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there are so many different ways to approach that. I definitely one of the ways is, obviously looking at the impacts that we're seeing and not necessarily if you're trying to push policy for adaptation rather than mitigation, then you can absolutely be making the case without even really talking about climate change. And in some places, like here in Florida, that may actually be your best bet because of the political climate currently. But in other ways, if we do need mitigation policy, and I think what's most important for getting policymakers to understand that this should be top of mind is helping folks understand the connection between climate change and all of the other things that they think are politically important. So, climate change is inextricably tied to the economy. And the damages from climate change are going to be, already are, substantial. And so finding ways to frame climate change as an issue that relates to the ones they're already most caring about, helping them see that they already care about climate change. They just don't necessarily know it. When they care about immigration, climate change plays a huge role in immigration, right? So there's ways to sort of tie it to the other types of policies that are top of mind for them, so that we can make this saying, hey, if you care about the economy and immigration and this and this and this, you actually care about climate change. We need to do something about climate change.
Yeah. Well, so in that communication, how do we communicate urgency and
Mm.
execute effective advocacy without losing support and goodwill for environmental
Mm.
efforts?
That's great. I think one of, I think, people with very good intentions make a lot of mistakes when trying to communicate about climate change. And one of the major mistakes that people make is coming at it from a sort of shaming perspective, coming in and telling people everything that they're doing wrong and that they need to change and that it's their fault. And this sort of approach will just turn people off. Nobody wants to hear that they're messing up and it's all their fault. It tends to make people, put up their walls, get super defensive. So definitely not coming in with guilt and shaming is a really important approach. And I'm, saying this to my students. I have a project in class where my students are communicating with the public, and some of them choose to communicate with politicians. And they want to come in guns blazing, write these letters that are so, they've got a lot of anger in them. And I understand why they're angry. The students have every right to be angry, but that's not going to make friends. It's not going to get movement on these issues. So not coming in with blaming and shaming. And also not coming in too nihilistically, too defeatist. We do have to be presenting solutions when we're telling people this is a problem. Also, this is how I think we should solve it. Because if you're just giving people the problem, you're not giving them the opening to do something about it. And that, again, tends to shut people down if they don't see what the solution will be, especially if you can't present a solution to a politician, for example, that is going to work with their position and their constituents. They're not going to take action, right? They're not going to look at it. So coming in defeatist and coming in with shaming and blaming are things we need to avoid if we want to be making positive action on climate change.
Yeah. Well, so thinking about kind of how we spend our time with the public conversations,
Mm.
uh, should we be shutting down or steering away from conversations related to things like geoengineering or attempting to be a multiplanetary species or similar conversations that divert our attention away from mitigation and adaptation?
100% we should be avoiding. Yeah, I mean, I have pretty strong feelings about both of those things. I think that geoengineering is going to open up many more problems than it solves. And that, the most viable solutions that we have now are dangerous, very dangerous. And we're already conducting an experiment on Earth's climate. And I don't think that the answer to that uncontrolled experiment is a different uncontrolled experiment. But when it comes to public opinion, I really think we need to steer the conversation away from geoengineering other than, to correct misinformation about it. Because it gives people the sense that we don't have to do anything about the root cause of the problem. We don't have to deal with fossil fuels. We don't have to deal with emissions. It's okay. Science is going to come in and solve it and find this technological miracle that makes it all better. And that's not what geoengineering is going to be able to do. But it gives people that sort of false sense that we don't have to deal with the problem. And so I personally would love for us to steer conversations away from it. And the same comes or goes for interplanetary. Yeah, I mean, first of all, the timescales on which that would happen are so far out that we will have already created way too much damage on Earth. But it's also so expensive and so carbon intensive. There's so many other ways we could be spending those resources that could actually solve the problem rather than having us try to run away from it.
Yeah. Well, so thinking about you mentioned earlier on, you mentioned ideologically entangled sciences.
Mm,
Um, I wanted to ask you about how we get to a place where climate change isn't politicized,
mm.
and where there's a broad consensus among policymakers across the United States that we need to act on climate. Could you talk about that idea of ideologically entangled sciences and how
Mhm.
we get to a place where climate change isn't so politicized?
Yeah. I mean, if I had like the one sentence answer that solved this, then we wouldn't be here, right? This would all be over. We would have solved the problem and we'd be living our lives as if climate change were a distant memory. But, um, I think one of the things that we know is that when it comes to public opinion on climate change and political opinion on climate change, that it isn't the science itself that people actually have a problem with. At the end of the day, people may spend time trying to debate the science so that they don't have to accept the problem, but that's not really the issue. The main reason that climate science isn't accepted has to do with the types of solutions that are posed for climate. And that's called solution aversion. So for many people who deny climate change, what they really don't like is that they believe that when we deal with climate change, we're going to do things like increase regulations. And they really don't like regulations. And so if they can just deny that climate change exists or that it's caused by humans or that there's anything we can do about it, they don't have to face the types of solutions that they really don't like. So one way that we can move past this is by presenting a broader array of solutions. There are ideas out there that are more in line with, for example, conservative ideals, and the ways that conservatives would want to handle a problem like this. Um, I'm actually writing a book right now on climate converts, on people who used to be deniers and who no longer deny climate change. And one of the big themes that I'm seeing is that for the most conservative climate deniers, once they are able to find a community of folks who believe the same things they do and who have climate solutions that align with their ideals, then they're able to accept climate change and even become activists,
Um,
um, because they need to see that it isn't just a liberal problem with liberal solutions. So presenting what we should be debating at this point isn't the science, and that has slowed some, but it's still out there. What we should be debating is what the right solution is. And there's room for healthy debate on that. That could be political, but the science of climate change itself shouldn't be. Does that make sense?
yes, so much sense. So do we need to, or should we keep communicating the basics of climate change in public conversations about
Mm.
environmental sustainability, or is that maybe helping the people that are still denying climate science by, continuing to have these basic conversations.
Yeah.
How should you think about, or how do you think about that?
That's a really good question. I think that for most people, again, it isn't the science that's actually the question. It's what can we do about it? There are people out there who legitimately want to understand the science and for sure explain the science. But most people, they want a basic understanding of why this is happening, and then they want to know what we can do about it. So I think that we should mostly be focusing on, it's real, it's caused by people, it's serious, and there are things that we can do about it. And if, some people still need a little bit of the science for the it's real or it's caused by humans, I don't have a problem with, communicating that part. We should be open about what those things are. But um, I think, again, that emphasizing what we can do about it and how we can solve the problem is the most important part of the conversation, because that's where people, so much of the conversation that we've had so far has been, it's real, it's serious, you should be scared. And then it sort of ended there. And then people sort of have a vague idea of like individual actions they can take. Like I should be riding my bicycle and changing my light bulb, but that doesn't feel like, if I do those things, climate change isn't going to end. And so we need to be much more focused on empowering people to understand how they can get involved in collective action, what kinds of things are happening locally, what kinds of things are happening at the state level, how are corporations being held accountable, how can they help hold corporations accountable. Those types of parts of the conversation, I think, are really needed and will help people feel more empowered and less like this is a huge problem that I can't do anything about, so I'm just going to go back to living my daily life.
Yeah. Well, so maybe a couple more questions related to kind of the future of this work. What do you think the future of environmental communication looks like based on the trends that you're seeing, the changes in mindsets, the more solutions oriented conversations? How do you think things will move forward or can move forward in the maybe 3 to 10 year time horizon?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that most folks working in environmental communication, in climate change communication now understand that we need a solutions-oriented approach. And I'm seeing more of that now, which is really great. I'm also seeing, and I think we'll see more of really good storytelling when it comes to environmental and climate communication. It's so important to be able to tell good stories about why people care, good stories about why you should be involved, but also good stories about what the future could look like. We get so many of these negative stories of what the future will look like if we don't act, so many stories of what we don't want to move toward, but we haven't been given stories of things we do want to move toward. I'm starting to see people, a lot of the really good books coming out recently about climate have these sections in them where they tell a positive story. This is what the future could look like if, we have great public transportation and our cities are more walkable and, all of these beautiful things that we could have. Those stories need to be out there and there need to be more of them. And I do think that's the direction that it should go, if not is going, when it comes to climate and environmental communication. And then, of course, there's just like the types of communication that we have now are changing so rapidly with social media and the rise of AI. And that's a whole another entire can of environmental worms. But I think that the medium through which these messages are coming is going to keep changing as well. And I can't fully predict the future on that, but I do see possibilities there that are exciting. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Jo, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about your work and share insights and wisdom. And I hope we can continue the conversation down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.